When Vladimir Lenin seized power in Russia in 1917, he created the world's first socialist state. But other socialists said that Lenin's dictatorship wasn't true socialism at all. Over the next 60 years, people who called themselves socialists, often disagreeing violently with each other, would rise to power in scores of countries all over the globe, until they ruled more than 60% of humanity.
I have seen the future, and it works. Those were the words of American journalist Lincoln Steffens after visiting the Soviet Union in 1919. Even though the Bolshevik Revolution frightened people around the world, for many it seemed to validate Karl Marx's prophecy that socialism's triumph was inevitable. Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. Welcome to the second episode of Heaven on Earth, a think tank special. In this hour, the communist revolution spreads to China. Democratic socialism comes to Europe, and socialism emerges as a new path to economic growth in the third world. But as socialism in its many forms continues to spread, it brings with it disappointment and despair. Nowhere does the reality live up to the ideal. And so we begin in the new Soviet Union, that is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.
Vladimir Lenin died of a brain hemorrhage in January 1924. He was only 53 years old. But in his relatively short life, he had laid out a path to power for revolutionaries around the world.
What Lenin did electrified, excited, inspired, terrified different people all over the world, depending on their frame of mind. And one of the more curious things it did was it gave birth to fascism. Lenin had showed that you could take Marxist doctrine and sort of twist it all around. And there was Mussolini in Italy, and he says he too is a revolutionary. For him, like for Lenin, making the revolution is the main thing. And he says, well, if we could throw out the proletariat and put in the vanguard of the proletariat, maybe we could throw out the proletariat and put in the nation instead. And all over Europe, there were groups of socialists who suddenly became nationalists. One, but not the only one, who did was Hitler, who comes along and has this new ideology of National Socialism, which retains a lot of socialist principles, but adds on the implacable hatred of the Jews.
Benito Mussolini joined forces with Adolf Hitler to launch a world war even more devastating than the last. The alliance between Italy, Germany, and Imperial Japan placed Mussolini in bloody opposition to his old socialist comrades. In the end, the grandiose ambitions of fascism went up in smoke. The world last glimpsed Mussolini's body strung up at an abandoned gas station in Milan. The very next day, Hitler shot himself. With the defeat of the Axis powers, the ideology of fascism collapsed. But the death of this strange offshoot only cleared the way for other branches of socialism to flourish. In the aftermath of World War II, communism spread like never before. The Soviet Union's military gains in World War II set stage for communist governments to take power in Eastern Europe and North Korea. But communism's biggest post-war conquest was yet to come. 4 years after the war's end, insurgent communist forces in China drove the pro-Western nationalist government off the mainland. In January 1949, the communists marched into Beijing to declare the birth of the People's Republic of China. Their leader was a 55-year-old intellectual named Mao Zedong.
Mao was a true revolutionary. He did not believe in normalcy. He did not believe in routine. He disliked bureaucracy. What he did was to mobilize millions of peasants to join the communist revolution.
Mao gave the Chinese people what came to be called the Iron Rice Bowl, a promise of lifelong economic security. But the price was submission. The party would soon control everything. The books people read, the clothes they wore, even whom they married, and how many children they had.
Mao felt that one has to really not wait for changes in the social system at all, but change human beings just as they are at once. That means to educate them and cut them off from all previous culture. Lenin allowed his people to read the classics and had access to the old literature. And Mao cut it all off, and for a while all they could read is inanities in the so-called Red Book. So he had this idea that if you do that, you completely cut them off from the past and create new human beings that way.
For nearly a decade, China followed the Soviet model of nationalized industry and collectivized agriculture. But the results were disappointing, and Mao grew impatient.
He became disillusioned with the Soviet model, and he thought he could improve upon it and bring communism overnight. He was truly a utopian thinker. And so that is when, in the late 1957, he launched what has been come to be called the Great Leap Forward.
At the core of the Great Leap Forward was a new Chinese institution, the People's Communes, more than 23,000 of them, comprising more than 500 million people. By mobilizing the country's vast labor pool, Mao believed his experiment would catapult China ahead of the West in both agriculture and industry. But the country's frenzied commitment to the Great Leap Forward led only to impossibly high production quotas and inferior products. In one program, the government tried to speed up steel production by encouraging peasants to build backyard steel mills on communes across China. For raw materials, the peasants donated iron goods from their own homes, including woks and other cooking utensils. The steel produced was worthless.
Mao also emphasized on agriculture production. One way he thought speeding up the agriculture growth was to plant it more densely, and that's scientifically irrational, and that did not really increase the production. Very soon, in 1959, there was also some drought, flood, and sort of natural disaster, plus this human policy, and that became a killer combo.
The peasants were forced to work long hours every day. They were totally exhausted by this. They weren't getting enough food to eat. They were literally, in some areas, starving. And it is estimated that this utopian idea led to the death of 30 to 40 million Chinese peasants.
A century earlier, Karl Marx had dreamt of the final stage of socialism, a society of complete human fulfillment, where a person might hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, and write poetry in the evening. He called it communism. In Russia and China, the word had come to mean something very different. But communism was far from the only form of socialism to flourish after the war. In Western Europe and a few other places, a competing version was making new gains. It was called democratic socialism, or more often, social democracy. Its adherents were convinced that the true, humane, and democratic essence of socialism could still be reclaimed from impostors like fascism and communism. At the forefront of the movement was Britain's Labour Party, which challenged Winston Churchill in the first general election after Germany's surrender.
We have shown that we can organize the resources of the country to win the war. We can do the same in peace.
As Britain went to the polls, socialism's greatest hopes rode on the shoulders of Labour's unassuming leader, Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee began life as the painfully shy son of a prominent London solicitor. The Attlees had a vacation home and 5 full-time servants. They were devout Christians and active in volunteer work.
The first thing you need to understand about Clement Attlee is that he came to socialism despite himself. It wasn't where he wanted to be, it wasn't what he was brought up to be. He had the fairly automatic conservative opinions of a man of his class at that time.
Attlee graduated from Oxford and drifted into law. Then, one fall evening, his brother invited him to visit a club for disadvantaged boys in the notorious slums of East London's Limehouse district.
For the first time, he saw the conditions that the poor lived in England, that it changed his life. He saw children starving. He saw huge families crammed into tiny, squalid little rooms with no furniture and no food and no heating. He saw the utter misery in which the poor lived and compared that to the way he had been brought up. This made him a socialist.
Within a year and a half, the 24-year-old Attlee took over as club manager and moved in. The Limehouse district would remain his home for the next 14 years. In 1908, he joined a group of socialists within Britain's Labour Party.
Attlee believed that if people lived in slum houses, if they were sick and couldn't have proper medical care, they grew up to be different people from those who lived in prosperity. A canon of socialism is you have to change the physical environment if you want to improve human nature, and that Attlee certainly believed.
Attlee volunteered for combat during World War I and fought with extraordinary courage. As the government mobilized the economy for war, he and others saw it as evidence that socialism could work. The influence of socialists within the Labour Party was growing. In 1918, they revised the party's constitution to support common ownership.
The British Labour Party was not started as a socialist party. It was started as a Labour Party, as a way for the labor unions to get some more clout or representation in politics. It then attracted more and more kind of middle-class intellectuals who were socialists. And in 1918, to make the middle-class socialists happy, the party adopts a platform which explicitly embraces socialism as the party's ideology. And where it does so is in this section that's called Clause 4, which basically said what we believe in is a society in which all the productive power is owned socially, meaning by the government or by the community.
Attlee rose to become the Labour Party's leader. During World War II, he was second only to Winston Churchill in Britain's national unity government. When the peace was finally won, much of Britain lay in ruins. In June 1945, the country held its first general election in nearly a decade. The choice was between Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee, two men who had joined together to fight the Germans, but now had different visions of how to rebuild Britain.
Any British family, including the most devoted Labour family, if they'd been asked who they wanted round for supper, they would have chosen Winston Churchill rather than Clement Attlee any day. But Winston Churchill seems to stand for the old ways, for unemployment, for poverty, for no medical care, for an inadequate system of education. Attlee was a very much more withdrawn figure, very quietly spoken little man, with very little personal charisma. But what he stood for was what appealed to the British people.
By noon on July 26, the results were becoming clear. Labour had won by a landslide.
Never before have the electors shown clearly their desire that there should be in this country a Labour government carrying out Labour's full policy.
Socialism had never before won so clear a mandate.
The election was really fought on one issue, the welfare state. Attlee had a vision of a new Jerusalem, of a welfare state, of a city on a hill, of a society that would provide comprehensive national insurance. So this is a radical, reforming government which intends to transform British society.
Alongside the social welfare system, the other cornerstone of Attlee's new policy was nationalization. Clause 4 was still enshrined in the party's constitution. Attlee now had his chance to bring common ownership to Britain.
Let's go forward into this fight in the spirit of William Blake. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall the sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land.
Attlee had published a book called The Labour Party in Perspective in the 1930s, but he reissued it when he was Prime Minister and with an introduction that re-endorsed the same points. And it called for complete socialism. And he went on to say that he wanted all large industry nationalized and that small industry could remain in private hands for a time. But his ultimate vision was a completely socialized economy.
Attlee's government would remain in power for 6 years. Before it left office in 1951, it had nationalized much of the country's industry and introduced an array of social welfare programs.
They took into public ownership coal, rail, steel, road haulage, gas and electricity. They created a national health service, free medical care for everybody. They instituted a system of pension by rights at a level which made old age dignified, if not prosperous. I mean, they had a pretty busy 6 years. I don't think any government's ever been as busy.
As the Attlee government put socialism to work rebuilding Britain, the idea was being used for building a nation in another part of the world. A war-torn Britain could no longer support its far-flung empire. And one by one, colonies and territories began to fall away from the mother country. 1948 brought the creation of the new state of Israel from part of the British trusteeship of Palestine. For decades, the Zionist movement had been struggling to create a Jewish state by settling Jews in Palestine. Many of these settlements were collective socialist villages called kibbutzim.
The kibbutz saw itself as socialist, but also at the same time as the expression of a national revolution. And they saw themselves as, in fact, the future Jewish society of this land.
Kibbutz Genasar is nestled along the western banks of the Sea of Galilee. was founded in 1937 by a group of young socialists. And it soon became the base of the Palmach, the elite commando wing of the Jewish Defense Forces.
We wanted to influence the country. That was the idea. We wanted to influence the country and stand for equality and all the things we believed in.
Moshe Abbes came to Kibbutz Genosar in 1940, when he was just 20 years old. In those early years, the kibbutz did not have tents, so he slept on the grass. But for Moshe and others, the sacrifice was worth it.
The spirit of the kibbutz, what gave us the strength to live that way. Someone asked me once if I was religious, and I told them I have one religion, and that is the kibbutz. It covers everything you need.
The War of Independence came in 1948, and the kibbutz-based Palmach forces spearheaded the Jewish victory. With the support of the new state of Israel, Genosar began to flourish. It built permanent homes, ran a profitable fishing operation, raised chickens, dairy cattle, and honeybees, and grew crops like bananas, mangoes, olives, and tomatoes.
I had never worked in farming or agriculture before, and I had never had to go by the decisions of a collective. But because what I'd been through in the past, all this wasn't hard for me.
Isaac Rotem settled at Genosar in 1948. He is one of the hundreds of thousands of European Jews who came to Israel in the wake of the Holocaust.
I came through all the camps. Camps in Auschwitz, camps in Cyprus, and suddenly I felt like I was part of one big family. Suddenly you feel there is someone who cares about you, someone keeping up with you.
The kibbutz was socialism on a human scale. Instead of the government owning everything, as it did in the Soviet Union, and to a lesser extent in Britain, the community owned everything and made all decisions collectively.
The motto of the kibbutz movement was borrowed from Marx, which was, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. There was no private property. Everything was shared in common, but it was all done in democratic fashion, that is, in group meetings or committee meetings where people could present their needs, and the kibbutz would democratically decide what to do to make sure that that person had his or her needs met.
You did not need any salary because you got food in the dining room, you got clothes in the special store. At the very beginning, at least, you had no private clothes. The storehouse distributed every week clothes to the members. You could receive a shirt that another member had the week before.
Like many other communal experiments, including Robert Owen's New Harmony, the kibbutz even tried to reshape family life. There would be new roles for husbands and wives, and parents and children.
Half the kibbutz members are women, and the idea was that they would be liberated from, not childbearing, of course, that's impossible, but liberated from bringing up their children, liberated from laundry, liberated from cooking, liberated from all the cares that women normally have. So they decided very early on that it was the collective's responsibility to raise the children. The children belong to all of us, and we are all responsible for looking after them. They wouldn't be under the tyranny of a bourgeois mother and father. They would be free members of the children's society, living with their own age group.
There was a notion of Ben Kibbutz, the son of the kibbutz, or the daughter of the kibbutz. In some kibbutzim, you even had that when a child was born, the General Assembly met and decided what will be his name of the child. How will he be called?
Genosar's membership would eventually swell to nearly 400 adults. The kibbutz movement would grow to include 270 kibbutzim, with some 130,000 members, about 5% of Israel's population, and play a leading role in the life of the new state.
They marked out the border to start with, very much so, in the north, in the west, in the south, everywhere. Where there were kibbutzim, there was Israel. And they provided a major part of the agriculture. As time went on, they also produced a large amount of the industrial output. They contributed out of all proportion politically. The first two prime ministers were kibbutz members. The first cabinet of Israel, I think nearly half were kibbutz members. Army commanders, initially all the army and military commanders, these were kibbutz members. And I would go as far as to say that without the kibbutz, there wouldn't have been a state of Israel.
Much was unique about the Jewish state. But in choosing socialism as its strategy for development, Israel was part of a swelling tide. For the nations reaching for independence in the aftermath of World War II, state planning was held out as the quickest path to prosperity. 60 nations in the developing world would eventually adopt some form of socialism. Most were in Africa. The country that became known as Tanzania would provide the world with a leader whose vision of socialism fused the ideas of the West with the traditions of Africa. His name was Julius Nyerere. Nyerere's father was a tribal chief in northwestern Tanganyika, as the British territory was then known.
And when the colonialists wanted somebody from the chief family to go to school, and he was virtually taken away from his goods and taken to school. That was the beginning of Julius.
By 1949, Nyerere had made it all the way to the University of Edinburgh in Scotland.
At Edinburgh, he started studying with socialist teachers who talked about community property, and Nyerere said, "We've got community property, that's what we have in my tribe." And suddenly, it seemed as if the ways that he was used to, which he had always been told were very backward and sort of a source of shame, were actually corresponding very nicely to the most advanced social thought, that is, the ultimate society that people in Europe were looking forward to.
When Nyerere returned to Tanganyika in 1952, colonial unrest had spread across the continent. To the north, Kenya was engulfed in the violent Mau Mau rebellion. Tanganyika was much quieter, but talk of independence was in the air. Nyerere took a job as a teacher, but he found his true calling in politics. He soon remade an old social club into his country's first political party. As the party attracted thousands of followers across the nation, Nyerere kept the title of his old profession, Mwalimu, Swahili for teacher. In 1961, Tanganyika finally won its independence from Britain. At midnight on December 9th, the Tanganyikan flag flew for the first time. The next year, the country swore in Julius Nyerere as its first president. He had been elected with more than 98% of the vote. Nyerere set out to slay the three dragons that plagued his country: ignorance, poverty, and disease. His weapon would be socialism, fused with the ancient tribal customs of Africa. The word he used to describe it was ujamaa, Swahili for familyhood.
What my father believed in socialism, the way I understand it, is that right after independence, most Tanzanians were uneducated and were not all that wealthy. So we had to to move together.
Rosemary Nyerere was born in the same year her father led the country to independence. She is now a member of parliament herself.
Mwalimu used to say that it's not new because that's how we live. You go to a typical Tanzanian village, a typical African village. We don't have these nuclear families, just the mother and the father and the children. We have lots of people living around. We help each other. So it's not really new.
By 1967, Tanganyika had merged with the island of Zanzibar to become Tanzania. Nyerere had been advocating his brand of African socialism for more than 4 years, but he had not imposed it on the country. He now decided to write it into law. Nyerere laid out his roadmap to socialism in a speech that became known as the Arusha Declaration.
This was a declaration, as it said, not just for Tanzania, but for all of Africa, and indeed other Africans did look upon it that way because it was the most complete, most ambitious attempt to create a kind of communist manifesto for Africa.
Nyerere nationalized the banks and major industries, promising to give workers control of the means of production. And foreign investments would be turned away in the name of self-reliance. According to Nyerere, socialism would now pave the way to true independence.
The declaration, when it came out, spelled out so many things, a certain kind of utopia. There was this feeling that alongside economic development, you created a new human being. It was a whole new idea that talked about caring for the next fellow. That was an exciting period.
Nyerere encouraged Tanzanians to reorganize their communities into collectives he called Ujamaa villages. These new villages would build socialism, and they would also provide access to schools, hospitals, and water. Across the harbor from the capital city of Dar es Salaam, Gesalole became an Ujamaa village in 1971.
After Mwalimu Nyerere encouraged us to form Ujamaa villages, we were the first to respond and make our village an Ujamaa village. After we began leading the Ujamaa way of life, we were able to get facilities for keeping poultry, fishing. See that boat over there? We didn't have it before. We got it with our own initiative, and we made progress.
Nyerere's vision of African socialism won the admiration of many in the West. As the Cold War intensified, many saw it as the best alternative to Soviet-style communism in the Third World. Support, both moral and financial, poured in.
World Bank presidents would fly out, heads of donor agencies would fly out. Students would come to spend a half a year or a year at the University of Dar es Salaam. The University of Dar es Salaam was a great place in the mid-1960s and early 70s. This was seen as a serious, well-reasoned attempt at socialism, and the feeling was, let's support this experiment.
Talk of socialism's potential in the Third World came amid disappointments in Europe. In places like Great Britain, pensions and socialized medicine continued to enjoy broad support. But state planning had not delivered on its promise.
There's a tension between Britain in the 1960s. On the one hand, we have the image of the swinging 60s, the world of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the world of Carnaby Street. The problem was that the kind of creative energy that you saw going into music and clothing didn't go into most parts of the British economy.
And there was suddenly this colour and efflorescence, but what it concealed was the fact that the economy was essentially dying. And we're living on the credit of the past, on old, declining, rusting industries like coal mining, shipbuilding, and steel. And nobody knows where the money's going to come from now on. So it was a kind of fool's paradise.
In 1971, the Times of London called the country's condition the British disease.
The problem with the welfare state was not that it wanted to distribute goods to the people of England. The problem was that a society bent on questions of distribution, bent on questions of consumption, was not a society that was going to deal with the underlying economic problems of how you produce enough, how you produce efficiently, how you compete in a global market. And that's the imbalance.
The world was changing, and it seemed that British industry simply couldn't keep up. Laws designed to protect British workers now prevented management from changing old practices. Workers demanded and won ever higher wages, even as productivity stagnated. In 1975, inflation hit 24%.
What essentially happened was that the wage settlements, as they became higher, pushed inflation higher. And that leads to an inflationary spiral, which was very difficult to control.
Since 1945, Labour and Conservative governments alike had preserved Clement Attlee's social welfare programs and most of his nationalizations. But by the mid-1970s, a growing faction within the Conservative Party placed the blame squarely on the legacy of Attlee's government.
In their view, what basically happens in post-war Britain is that socialism, disruptive trade unions, and an expensive welfare state lead to a precipitous political and economic decline. What they see is a welfare state which created a dependency culture. It robbed people of initiative. It robbed people of responsibility. It disrupted the market. It made it impossible for the country to get anything really done.
Among the most outspoken of these conservatives was the party's new leader, Margaret Thatcher.
Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I presume this is to enable us to sweep Britain clean of socialism.
Mrs. Thatcher just couldn't bear the idea that British decline should be taken for granted. She rejected that with her guts. She thought Britain should be great. Searching around for what was wrong, she decided that what the economy needed was a dynamic shakeout, was to make people self-reliant again, and above all to break the power of the trade union movement.
In the summer of 1978, the Labour Party was in power and gearing up for a new general election.
The Labour government felt that what they really needed was to have a year of very, very low inflation. So they imposed a norm on trade unions, or on all workers, of a 5% increase in wages. In December of that year, the first test of the norm came in a strike or a dispute at Ford Motor Company. And Ford settled for, I believe, about 16%, which was way above a 5% norm. At that moment, the floodgates opened, and all sorts of workers who had pent-up demands for higher wages essentially put those demands to government.
Throughout December 1978 and January 1979, massive strikes shook the country. It would become known as the Winter of Discontent. Most of the striking workers were in the public sector, the nationalized services and industries, truck drivers, teachers, medical workers.
There were stories of ambulance drivers saying things like, yes, we know some people will die if we don't deliver them to the hospital, but we're going to strike anyway. There was a famous strike of grave diggers in Liverpool, which meant that the bodies piled up and were unburied. And there were similar strikes in other public services. Well, this kind of strike really massively erodes public support for strikes, for unions, and for a government that seems completely unable to do anything about it. In December 1978, the Labour government, despite lots of difficulties, still had a lead in the polls over Thatcher and the Conservatives. It was a tiny lead, it was 1 or 2%. By the end of February 1979, less than 3 months later, Thatcher was out in front with a 20% lead.
In Israel, too, socialism was losing some of its appeal. The founders of the kibbutz movement had believed that the communal way of life would embed itself ever more strongly over time. But as the years passed, the trend on the kibbutzim was away from collectivism.
זה התהליך שנמשך למעשה מההתחלה.
If in the beginning we got clothes once a week from the clothing storehouse, then later there were closets, and everyone had their own clothes at home. If at first all the food was in the dining hall, then eventually everyone had an icebox. And then we started to keep things like beverages and fruit inside the house.
After Israeli statehood, the move toward a more private lifestyle accelerated. Members began to receive small cash allowances to spend as they wished. The changes extended to families as well. The kibbutz children had lived and slept in a communal children's house. But by the early 1970s, some parents were beginning to have second thoughts.
The communal sleeping, this sounded very nice, but it was enormously frustrating for parents, particularly for mothers, who really felt they weren't getting enough of their children. They weren't being with them enough, they weren't seeing them enough, they weren't being able to give them enough love.
The children's houses slowly began to empty. Many of the kibbutzim took out loans to pay for adding on children's rooms to their parents' homes. In the midst of such internal change, the kibbutzim suffered a major blow from without. In May 1977, Menachem Begin carried a conservative government into power for the first time in Israel's history. The old Labour government was out, and with it went the subsidies, tax breaks, and contracts it had bestowed on the kibbutzim.
There was a time when we were wanted in Israel. Because we lived in the problematic areas. We produced the food. We were the heroes of this country. Eventually, the state let us know, hinted to us, we don't need you anymore. You are a place of residence like any other. Start being independent.
The kibbutzim were still socialist communities. But practical problems were forcing more and more compromises between the ideal and reality. Tanzania brought far greater disappointments. It was beginning to seem that Julius Nyereri's version of socialism was not as democratic as his supporters had hoped. In 1965, 3 years after he was elected president, he amended the country's constitution to ban all political parties but his own. Nyerere was asked whether a one-party system included safeguards against the abuse of power.
To some extent, there are safeguards, but I have sufficient power under the Constitution to be a dictator. This is the dilemma of this movement. Sometimes you build the leader to the extent that At the end, when you think you have become free, the fellow has become so powerful you don't know what to do with him.
Nyerere was looking away from the West for a model of socialism more suited to a poor country like Tanzania. In 1965, he made his first visit to China.
You see, in the year we went to China, Tanzania was in famine. And by that time, we were only 15 million people. We went to China with 1 billion, and everybody had a full stomach. 1 billion, think of it. They were making their own rails, and they were engineers, building their own houses, building their own roads. You see, and here we couldn't even make a bridge.
China began to take a special interest in Tanzania's development. It would eventually contribute more than $2 billion in economic aid, more than it gave to any other country. As the friendship between the two countries deepened, Nyerere's vision of socialism seemed to veer more and more toward the Chinese model. And life in Tanzania began to revolve increasingly around Nyerere's single party.
After the one-party system was implemented, the country became more and more authoritarian. Party Youth Wing, for example, was established that would go around sort of imitating the Red Guards in China. The major newspapers were party paper. The broadcast media was entirely under government control. The independent trade union movement was absorbed into the ruling party. Virtually all independent association life was either suppressed or brought under the control of the party.
In 1967, the country began to overhaul its schools, casting off the old Western system. Students would now learn practical trade skills and socialist ideology.
Practical education in science, physics, chemistry, and biology ceased. And they say this is now triumph, but as for us, it was the end of everything.
Christopher M. Tequila is the pastor of the Full Salvation Church in Dar es Salaam and the leader of a Tanzanian opposition party. He has been arrested more than 24 times for his political activity. His problems with the government began while he was in secondary school.
All the teachers were from the West, and they taught us the sanctity of human life and dignity and all these things. Then all of a sudden, we were told that those people who were told to call as our brothers because they love democracy, human rights, now we should call them imperialists and all these things. I was confused.
The Tanzanian people did not embrace all aspects of Nyerere's socialist experiment. As much as he urged them, they simply were not moving to the Ujamaa villages. In 1973, Nyerere lost patience. He ordered all Tanzanians to relocate to the planned villages within 3 years. There were problems from the start.
During the execution of the program, there were mistakes. Sometimes a village could be taken to a place with no access of water, you see. Sometimes the people who performed the task were too brutal. At times it happened.
We were taken by surprise when the trucks came to relocate us. We had to leave the cashew nuts in the orchard just when they were ready for harvest.
Zaituni Abbasi's village was relocated to Gezalole in 1974. Not everyone wanted to go.
Walijigaa baadhi mbili. Wengine walifurahia.
Some of them were happy to come here and are with us through to this day. But others tried to escape and run away. That's why that place over there is called the Mango Tree of the Militia. It's because the militia had to be deployed at that mango tree to keep them under control and keep them from escaping.
The villages were disastrous for food production. In 1970, Tanzania had produced enough surplus corn to export more than 500,000 tons a year. Just 4 years later, the country had to import nearly as much just to feed itself. Tanzania's government-owned industries were in no better shape. Typical was the massive Morogoro shoe factory. By the early 1980s, it operated at 4% of capacity. Conflict on Tanzania's border with Uganda and an international oil crisis struck a further blow to the economy.
After the war, things got tough. There was a shortage of a lot of things. I remember personally walking to Kenya to come back with toothpaste, bathing soap, and things like that. There was also a shortage of food. There had been a famine. So things were bad. Things were bad.
Julius Nyerere had succeeded in creating a nation. But socialism had failed to make it prosper.
For many in the West, mostly on the left side of the political spectrum, Third World socialism seemed an antidote to Soviet-style communism. But nations that took this path, like Tanzania, did not leap forward. In contrast, those that embraced private ownership and foreign trade, like Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore, boomed. These so-called little tigers provided a vivid rebuttal to socialist rhetoric. Be sure to join us again for the concluding episode of Heaven on Earth, the rise and fall of socialism. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
To learn more about Heaven on Earth, the rise and fall of socialism, visit us online at pbs.org. You'll find complete interviews and more about the people and events that shape socialism around the world.
Next time, in the East, communism falls, while social democracy is reinvented in the West. What shape will socialism take in the 21st century? Find out next time on the conclusion of Heaven on Earth.